there's a time lag to doing the research and prepping research and doing field testing and then getting the results and then actually getting all the complicated physics and algorithms and changes into global modeling.
Changes happen. Governance has to change. Governance can't adapt and cope with those changes. Civilizations fail.
So if it takes 5 years to do a cycle of that, what started happening was things have already changed again, and it just becomes a constant effort.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Wes Clark. I'm a longtime attendee and member here at AREI. And Chip has been kind enough to give me a couple of minutes to talk a little bit about national security and climate change with you. You know, as early as 2005, the Defense Department was identifying climate change as a contributor to conflict. And we knew that the dislocations of climate change would cause migration, would cause tensions over things like water or grazing rights, and might provide opportunities for terrorist groups to infiltrate. Well, all that has become absolutely true. The fight in Syria that began in 2010 was driven in part by drought in Syria that led to in-migration into the cities that led to dislocation. What's been going on in the Horn of Africa for 20 years is driven by climate change. We've recently seen coups in Mali and in Niger. Burkina Faso is in trouble right now in Africa. Terrorists have infiltrated, governments are falling, assistance programs are being terminated or modified. Societies are at risk of being militarized. Central African Republic, for example, Wagner Group is in there. All of this is in one way or another connected to climate change because it changes how people make a living. It changes patterns of movement. It changes the survival instincts and survival needs and activities that people undergo. But if you put this in larger historic perspective, this has been a constant problem for human civilization for 7,000 years. I mean, we always go back to Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, and people look at why civilization emerged as it did. But if you actually look at the patterns of those civilizations and the rise and the fall, so much of it is a function of climate change, which affects governance, either through migration or economic deprivation. Governments grow and then they fail. We're in that same cycle right now. We have problems facing us that are really challenging the governance that we have. Will the United Nations and the various nation states get a grip on decarbonizing our economies? Can we extract carbon from the atmosphere that's already there? Can we put programs in place to mitigate the impact of the climate change that's all ongoing? And in our own country, can we deal with immigration? Can we deal with big oil and the hydrocarbon lobby? Can we deal with individual members of Congress to move programs in the right direction? Can we prevail upon industry to do the research and implement programs that will move us toward a less carbon-intensive environment? And can we do all of this quickly enough to forestall 5 degrees centigrade rise in temperature, the melting of the Greenland ice pack, and even more profound dislocations? So we're no different in this one respect than previous civilizations. Changes happen. Governance has to change. Governance can't adapt and cope with those changes. Civilizations fail. So when we're looking at climate change, we're looking at not just a national security problem, we're looking at a profound problem of our current civilization. So I want to lay this on the table. I know you're going to have an interesting couple of days of discussions. I wish I was there to participate in it. I just want to underscore the profound significance of what all of us are engaged in today. Thank you very much. Let's get it done if we can do it. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Lieutenant Virginia Kelly, and I'm very excited to be here for the Climate Crisis and Military panel, but very excited to introduce you to retired Captain Robyn Tyner of the U.S. Navy. She has had an incredible career in the Navy over 33 years. She's been a combat veteran leading diverse teams in air, land, and sea operations worldwide. She's been in strategic organizational management. Her qualifications include surface warfare, information dominance, hurricane, typhoon forecasting, and nuclear weapons consequence analysis. She also managed a $350 million science and research portfolio and facilitated the creation of the Navy Task Force's Climate Change and Energy. She currently serves on the board of directors of the Conservatives for Responsible Stewardship and the Exeter, New Hampshire Energy Committee. So she is going to talk to you a little bit about Conservatives for Responsible Stewardship and then go into all her amazing work in the Navy, and we'll finish with, if we have time, with a couple questions.
Good afternoon. And I do want to give a nod to Conservatives for Responsible Stewardship that made it possible for me to be here today as I'm on their board. And what do I have to do to start? Okay. So just listening to some of the earlier discussions, I heard several people say something that really resonated with me about talking to people, no matter who they are, where they are, or who they're affiliated with. And I think if you look at the mission and the big areas that we work on, I don't think there's anyone, no matter, you know, where you live or what your political persuasion is, that disagrees with any of that. And a lot of it is just how we talk to people and how we reach out to people and what they value. And I think across the board, you know, people value their family, their home, their water. And if you take all the politics out of anything and just go to that level of values, we can get a lot done. If we ignore the people telling us to hate each other, we can make some progress. And I think that's how we made progress in the military, because we had to be apolitical. And so there's a thing called the Hatch Act, where you can't play politics in the military, you can't influence your subordinates or anything like that. So I would say in my entire career, I worked on 6 continents and every ocean, including the Arctic and most major seas. I don't ever remember working with people who cared what your politics were. That just wasn't where we worked. We worked on what is the mission, what are our requirements, what are the Department of Defense requirements, what are the Navy's requirements. So again, it's about your values, what do you care about. And I threw a couple pictures up here. So the center picture is Kwajalein, which is northwest of the Marshall Islands in the Pacific, and Sally just showed you Tuvalu, and there's several Pacific Island nations that are a major threat of sea level change. Well, so are places like Kwajalein and Wake Island and, you know, Hawaii and Guam and places that the military operates out of and cares about. On the left, there's a submarine coming through the ice up in the North Pole, and the submarines have operated up there for decades. Ship traffic hasn't so much. And so everything that's going on in the Arctic actually affects some of the submarines. And I just got all started thinking about the Arctic again with your presentation, because that was sort of my baby. My master's thesis was Arctic oceanography related. But one of the things while I was at ONR that we found, including some of the changing jet stream patterns and the polar vortex that everyone talked about and all of that, was there were actually changes beneath the surface in the water column that had never been like that before in all the recorded history of observations we had, where we knew that the top, roughly 150 meters of what we call the thermohaline, which is thermos temperature, haline salt, temperature and salinity changed up at the top, but then on down to the bottom, it was just all the same for temperature, salinity. And what we found a few years ago is a warm tongue of water intruding in through the Bering Strait, which is very significant to what the Navy would care about with submarines that don't want to be found, and not to get too sciencey, but how the water column is stratified and things like temperature changes affect how sound travels through water. So that would affect marine mammals that communicate through sound, and it affects Navy operating under there. Just a few other things just to go through a little bit of history. The top corner on my left is Army ribbon cutting ceremony here in Colorado back in 2008 for a solar farm. The lower left is, I'm not even sure where this one is, it could be anywhere, but so military gets called in for disaster relief. Well, here's a flood area. So this is something that could happen in a lot of areas of the world and could happen more and more often. So again, that's an interest. This top right, this is Admiral Sam Locklear, who I first met in my first Pentagon tour. We sort of kind of worked together in different divisions that worked with each other, largely in budget battle stuff. But then my second tour, he came in, relieved my boss, asked me to stay on, and I was on his personal staff, and probably one of the best bosses I ever had. And he went on to become the 4-star in charge of Indo-PACOM, which is one of 9 joint unified commands in all of DoD, and he was the commander. And back in 2013, when he was asked about the greatest national security threats, he called out climate change. So I felt like, good job, sir. You know, we trained him well. So down in the bottom, there's flooding in Norfolk. If anyone hasn't been to Norfolk, 20% of the Navy's there. It's the largest base in the Navy base in the world, and we have real problems there. There's a fellow named Roger Sorkin who did a great documentary a few years ago called Tidewater. If you haven't seen it, it's worth seeing. And these are all reasons why we cared, and they don't have anything to do with politics. They just have, and there's many, many more. I just had to pick a couple to put on a slide, but they have to do with doing your job. And this list here, the little thumbnails are from current directives that are out there by all the services. They're increasing. There's a lot more attention now. It started out kind of rough, and it started a little before 2008, but that's when we first got Task Force Energy completed, and I was there for Task Force Energy and the Arctic Roadmap and the Task Force Climate Change in the Pentagon, and we had some battles getting those through. I had a little control because I ran the Chief of Naval Operations decision forums and schedules, so when everyone tried to bump them, I could hold them in there. But we got some stuff done. And the one other thing in here I might point out is the Arctic and Global Prediction at Office of Naval Research. So while I was there, 80% of the DoD Arctic portfolio was within my portfolio, I'm sorry. 80% of DoD Arctic research was within my portfolio. And part of the reason that we focused on that so much in Navy gets back a little bit to something Sally had mentioned about changes in global weather prediction and weather patterns. And so we have these global weather models, and we need them because we care about things like operating ships and aircraft and putting people in and getting people out and doing it safely and having systems that work and do what they're supposed to do. And all of those things, well, not all of them, but most of them are dependent on things like weather and precipitation, and is it too cold, and can you get in, and what's the moon illumination, or what's the cloud cover, and things like that. So you need to know those things, so you need good weather models. Well, we use the Arctic regional model usually to initialize the global models. So we have to get the Arctic right so that we can get the rest of the world right. And there's a time lag to doing the research and prepping research and doing field testing and then getting the results and then actually getting all the complicated physics and algorithms and changes into global modeling. So if it takes 5 years to do a cycle of that, what started happening was things have already changed again, and it just becomes a constant effort. And we just found ourselves doing more and more and more in the Arctic to really understand what was going on. And that's the end of my slides. So I can sit down and take any questions that.
We just have 3 minutes left, so if anyone has any questions for Captain Tyner, feel free to ask now.
I guess you guys do it loud if you.
I have a question that's slightly peripheral to what you're talking about, but I think it's relevant. Do you imagine, say by 2040, a military that does not run on hydrocarbon for its hardware? And if you don't, what is the security architecture you have in place for your security of supply?
I don't really know the answer to that because I did retire a couple of years ago. I still do some work. I know that we are trying to get further and further away from running things on hydrocarbons with and there's a lot of autonomous vessels and smaller things, and how can we do things with less of the big traditional ships we've had. But honestly, we still have a lot of fuel guzzling, emissions causing stuff. And I guess that's maybe one thing I would say that you gave me inroads to, so I'm taking your inroads and taking it maybe somewhere else. But so if you think of what causes the emissions on Earth, and several people are talking about stopping, what can you do personally? Well, one of the greatest sources of emissions for CO2 and all the bad stuff is military operations. It really is, and what we're doing out there. And so I guess I would ask everybody to always question why, if you see us going to military operations before diplomacy, ask why, because it's not usually coming from the military. A lot of times, I just came from my 35th Naval Academy reunion, and we had a memorial service for the 41 classmates who died, and so, I mean, I'm not old enough to think that many of my classmates should have died, but, things happen, and you have friends and people who work for you and people you work for, and there's accidents. So the military members tend not to be the ones rushing us into conflicts. And we take an oath to the Constitution, which says we as a unit, if all a DOD was one person, it reports to the senior civilians in charge. So you have to really think about who we're electing, and it doesn't matter what party they're in, but what are the influences, and are we really making honest attempts at diplomacy before we resort to military ops? I mean, I'm obviously, I had a great career in the military, and when you need it, but it shouldn't be the first choice. And I'm sorry, that's like my free announcement that I took off of your thing.
I'd like to ask a question about, not long ago there was a controversy between the Navy and its sonar and how it affected whales, how it affected their migratory, how they were beached and all of that. Can you give us an update on that, the improvements or ignoring it or any of that?
Well, there was some things going on, especially in the 90s. We started something that was called low frequency active, which is horrible for the whales. And it was like the new technology that was come in and we're all going to use it. And I think there was awareness of how bad it was, and that it lasted a couple of years, but then it became, we're not doing that anymore. We switched to passive. I was junior enough that I can't tell you exactly who decided how to pull the plug, but we did figure it out, and we stopped. We have done, when I was in grad school, I did an Arctic thesis, but I almost went and did a thesis on whales and acoustics, and so that was my other area of interest. One of my girlfriends did that. And so the Navy really has been studying more about that. When I was at ONR, we had to very extensively consider that in partly just because of federal law, but partly because most of us cared, because a lot of us are working in oceans and environment. And we really looked at what types of frequencies and, how many decibels and where are you putting it and what time of year are you putting it. And for instance, in the Arctic, when we went up and did things, I'd say in the northern sides of Alaska, we would go into the villages and we would have a town meeting so we could do a presentation which would include indigenous people, and usually like the North Slope mayor or people like that would come in. And we would have to tell them exactly what we're doing and let them comment and really get the approval. Because we also learned that, I think my predecessors probably, that if you go in and you have those, and you're in those remote places and you have the indigenous communities that you've ignored or not listened to or haven't gotten their words of wisdom, they can hurt you. You know, they can cause things to go south. So it just behooved us all. There has been some new programs in the last few years in the Gulf of Alaska, and they are using active sonars again. A friend of mine who is a fellow oceanographer she lives in Alaska, and her husband's a fisherman. And we really dug into that, and we looked at the environmental impact statements. We were both out, Navy retired, and not convinced that they are thorough enough or considering enough. They almost look like they may have been assigned when we were pulling the string to an Air Force officer who didn't understand the ocean. And when you have this box that says you can't do this in this box, kind of missing the idea that if you do something in this box, the sound travels out of the water into the surrounding areas. I think that's still an issue that is going on and needs addressed, but overall, the Navy really has tried to clean up its act on the marine mammal impacts and acoustics.
Thank you.